Tonight, we have 13 stories, from Christmas to night guards, rituals, customer service, and more. A huge thank you to tonight's writers for allowing me to share these stories with all of you. In my last video, I said I was curious how many likes we could reach, and at the time of me recording this, it is sitting at 2,300. I can't get over that. So for this video, I'll say what I said in that one. If at any point you feel this video deserves a like, feel free to drop one. These stories do take quite a bit of time to put together and record, and liking the video helps push it into the algorithm so more people can see it. Every like helps immensely. Also, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. We're telling scary stories over here all the time, and we'd love to have you on board. Also, this video was recorded on a new mic. I'm sure you guys don't care, but I've been wanting to test out a dynamic mic for years, and with how well the channel is doing, I decided to finally pick one up. It's supposed to help eliminate background noise way better than my old one, which is nice for me because I'm not limited by when I can record anymore, and I thought you guys might appreciate it because there shouldn't be random Honda Civics in my audio anymore. Let me know how you guys like it. Is it better, worse, the same? I'm pretty curious. It was far cheaper than my other one because I didn't want to invest a lot and then not like it, but I gotta say I kinda like this one a bit more. It sounds pretty good for scary stories in my opinion. But I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Let me know. I hope you all enjoy the video. And as always, wash your damn hands. Before I tell you what I saw and why I decided to retire, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, I'm a woman. Yes, I used to get paid to kill people. No, not all contract killers are men. So stop being a sexist pig, fucking Cletus, and cut me some slack. Alright, now that the air is cleared, let's get down to it. I got the call from Mr. Pickles, his code name, the week before Christmas. He was my most reliable customer, found me on the dark web. The work was steady, and the target rarely put up a fight before I put two in their chest and one between their eyes. So I worked more or less exclusively for him. Mr. Pickles, that is. Never saw his face. He was a sweaty fella. I could smell the brine through the wall of the confession booth, but he always sat on the other side of a sliding panel. Easy job, said Mr. Pickles in his raspy voice. Outside the booth, I heard the heavenly voices of the choir practicing for midnight mass. I took out my pad of paper to take notes. Give me the details. Man, said Mr. Pickles. Age 40, rich, big house outside the city. And before you ask why he deserves it, as you always do, let me just say that he's a pedophile. That, in addition to pissing off people at his place of work, is enough to justify his demise. Mr. Pickles knows that I always ask for some dirt on the target. Chalk it up to me having a moral compass. I have to know what the world would be better off without the person I'm being paid to kill. Okay, I said. What's the route? I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out. There was a picture of the house. A large, luxurious mansion. Mr. Pickles, or whoever planned out the hits for him, had circled an area on the roof. A chimney. Get the fuck out. You're going straight down that, baby, said Mr. Pickles. My guy on the inside says it's wide enough for you to rappel without getting sooty. I laughed to myself. That's what she said. Nothing from Mr. Pickles. He was all business. Okay, I said. I'll be Mrs. Claus then. Any kids? 3. Mr. Pickles knew that I don't kill kids. I like to know if there are any on site so I can plan ahead. How much cash? Mr. Pickles slipped an envelope through a slot in the door. I opened it. 20,000 bucks in fresh bills. 20 large now, said Mr. Pickles. And another 80 when you finish the job. 100,000. Nice little Christmas bonus. I wanted a PS5. It was more than enough to pay one for the bot-running scalpers who'd gobbled them all up while I waited my turn in the queue like a good little capitalist. Groovy, I said. Christmas Eve, repeated Mr. Pickles. He sent me another text. A map. Your equipment will be stashed at this spot on the property. We did it that way so if I get stopped ahead of time, there'd be no evidence to tie me to a potential hit. After you grab the package, make your way up to the rooftop. The rappelling equipment will be set up. Get inside, do the job, and get out. Easy peasy. Easy for him to say. He never ran the hit. But I was as cold as they come. Killing people, for me, was like clockwork. I got the package on Christmas Eve, got geared up, went to the snow-covered roof, set down my pack, and rappelled down the chimney, soot free. But once I got inside, shit went south real quick. As soon as I got down, I heard the pitter-patter of tiny feet on the stairs. Santa? I turned. A Cindy Lou Who-looking girl was standing at the base of the stairs in a pink robe and furry pink slippers, her hair pulled into a messy top bun. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house, not a creature was stirring, except for a little girl with no amount of money in the world could convince me to kill. Hey there, I said quietly. It's Mrs. Claus, actually. Santa's really busy tonight. The girl's eyes twinkled with excitement. Did you get me the pony I asked for? I looked around the room. There were presents under the tree, but none in the shape of a pony. Sure, I said, hating myself for making false promises. Maybe her dad had bought her one, but when the family woke up tomorrow to find him executed, ponies would be the least of the kids' problems. No matter how much of a monster your parent is, losing one takes a lifetime of therapy to get over. If she found out her dad was the type who liked to put his hands in the cookie jar, there'd be even more therapy in store. The kid was supposed to be nestled snug in her bed, if the rhyme was to be believed, with sugar plums or whatnot. But here she was, asking me about ponies and looking me with those doe-like eyes. I remembered what the Grinch did and collected myself. I wasn't taking the Christmas tree, just the life of her father was all. But I decided to stay with the job. 100 grand was enough to take the next year off if I wanted to, and get that PS5 I'd been hankering for with some nice grill left over. I took her to the kitchen and poured her a cup of water. Go to bed, little one, I said. That pony will be waiting for you when you wake up. She smiled. I love you, Mrs. Claus. Dagger, straight to the heart. Tomorrow morning, her childhood would officially be over. Sleep well, I said. I'm almost finished here. The little girl pitter-pattered back up the stairs. I watched her go, then turned back to grab my pack, only to realize I left it on the roof. God fucking damn it. I walked to the chimney, grabbed the rope, and climbed back up top. Then I heard the sound of hooves on the roof behind me. I turned and saw him, and my blood ran as cold as the swirling winter air. There was a man, or a creature, with spindly, spider-leg reindeer antlers growing out of his skull. His face was metal. His eyes glowed a menacing shade of red. Who the fuck are you? I asked. He smiled. Then he spoke in a robot's voice. You can call me Rudolph the Red-Eyed Cyborg, or Rudy for short. I puffed out my chest. I wasn't about to let another man try and walk over me. Being a woman in the world is a balancing act. I was quick on the draw, too. But then I remembered that I'd forgotten my equipment. My pack was 5 feet away. All right, Rudy, I said. State your purpose. In his robotic voice, he spoke, his eyes burning like 2 embers in the dark of night. The man lives. Nah, I said. There's 100,000 on the line, and he's a kitty diddler. Rudy nodded. He's also going to stop the world from ending in 10 years. He said. I know because I'm from the future. This was turning into some real Terminator 2 type shit. I'll take my chances, I said, inching my way toward my pack. I don't take pity on heavy petting sickos. With an inhuman flash of movement, Rudy levitated and came eye to eye with me. He reached forward with his hand and put it on my forehead. I saw the ghost of Christmas future. I saw the Grim Reaper. I saw death and destruction. Mr. Pickles had taken the job from a shadowy figure. He worked for some top secret agency. A high-up CIA-type motherfucker. I saw them looking at a set of documents on the table. Turned out the kitty diddler I'd been hired to kill was a part of said organization. He was one of the guys responsible for hitting the big red button that launched the nukes at our enemies. I saw two parallel realities. Both took place on Christmas Eve 10 years in the future. In one, the kitty diddler had been replaced by another guy because I'd killed him. The guy hit the button when his crazed boss told him to and launched the nukes. The world ended in a few minutes' time as all foreign nations did the same. I saw an image of the Cindy Lou Who looking girl I'd seen on the stairs. She was 10 years older, a teenager. She was laying outside on their front lawn in a sea of melted snow. Her skin charred like she'd gotten the worst fucking sunburn in history. Her eyes were baked, little chunks of blackened coal. Her face was frozen in a terrified scream, the last thing she did before the nuke landed. Then I saw that, in the other reality, the kitty diddler was still alive. His wild-eyed superior told him to hit the red button, but instead of doing so, he paused. The other guys in the room started fighting, tearing at each other, and meanwhile, the kitty diddler grabbed a gun off one of the soldiers who'd fallen in the fight and unloaded a full clip of ammo into the machine that launched the nukes. It fizzled and popped and died. The kitty diddler got annihilated by another soldier, his body blowing up like a bloody Christmas piñata. But he didn't launch the nuke. The vision zoomed out, a full panorama of Earth. I saw that no one launched their nukes either. Thanks to the kitty diddler, humankind lived to see another day. I came back to the present. Rudy, the red-eyed cyborg, staring at me straight in the eyes. "The man lives," he said. "Roger that," I said. "I will haunt you for the rest of your life," said Rudy. "I will be waiting every second of every day, always ready to remind you that the hits you carry out have consequences. You're playing God, and I can play a real good devil." He smiled then, his mouth like a shark's, rows upon rows of serrated metal teeth. 10-4, good buddy," I said. Then I pissed my pants and fainted. A few hours later, I woke up in bed. I'd been dreaming about the kitty diddler, his bullet-riddled body lying dead in that top-secret bunker. The guy who'd saved the world by not pressing the big red button. I realized how long I'd played God. How many fates had I altered? How many threads of destiny had I cut? Changing the course of things one way or another, for better or worse. The thought terrified me a million times more than Rudy the red-eyed cyborg and his serrated shark's teeth. I got up and made coffee. I got a call from Mr. Pickles, too. "I'm looking at your target celebrating Christmas with his family. Just gave his daughter a pony, in fact. Why is this motherfucker not dead?" "Because I'm retired," I said. Outside the window, Rudy was staring at me, his eyes aglow. "Keep the 80,000. I have a PS5 to buy." My name's Carter, and for about 5 years, I worked at Walker Asylum. For the sake of confidentiality, and quite frankly for the safety of you reading this, I won't be releasing where it's located. At first, it was honestly just like sweeping the halls of a high school. Nothing but a mundane janitor job. The staff seemed to genuinely care for the patients, but what confused me is that most of the patients didn't seem to be insane. Sure, a lot of them were paranoid, or a little empty in the skull, but certainly not to the point of insanity. However, I slowly noticed that the longer they stayed, the more they slipped into losing it. I assumed it was just due to being locked away for long periods of time, but now I know. I know what snapped the poor bastard's sanity. One night I had to stay late due to a fight between two patients, leading to one being stabbed. And more than once. This meant I was stuck mopping up the blood, not to mention the piss and vomit from the easily nauseous. And let me tell you, it takes more than a wet mop and a bottle of bleach to get all that shit off of tiled flooring. As I was dumping out my second pail of dark red mop water, trying not to gag, Dr. Wendels, the head of psychology, came in bringing me a cup of coffee. "Sorry about the mess, Carter. If I were able to handle the sight of blood, I'd give you a hand." He was a stereotypical nerd, soft eyes behind a pair of rimmed glasses, a tall lanky figure, and a rather nasally voice. I laid down my mop and grabbed a coffee, thanking him. No big deal. This is why I'm getting paid. Although I might ask for a raise after this mess. He chuckled softly and agreed that my next paycheck would be significantly heftier. As I raised my coffee to my lips, I looked and asked him, "Why are you here so late anyway? Didn't all the staff leave like 2 hours ago?" For a very brief second, a face of panic, as if trying to find an answer, but instantly composing himself. "Yeah, well, as head I have quite a heavier load of paperwork than your average doctor." I nodded without giving it a second thought. After all, it was a solid excuse, given that running an institution like this one. After a few minutes of small talk, he left for his office as I continued scrubbing and mopping. I did what I could to make the floor look presentable. Well, as presentable as an asylum cafeteria can be. After cleaning up my supplies and storing them in the closet, I head to my office, which was only a little larger than the actual closet we store the supplies in. Yeah, I know, living quite lavishly. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the front door when suddenly I heard this fuzzy sound. It was kind of like a deep, muffled buzz you'd hear from a bee. I chalked it up to the crappy LED lights. I mean, I can't even remember how many of those I've had to change. I continued walking when suddenly that buzzing sound returned, this time followed by what I could only describe as the screech of a wounded animal. It was faint and muffled, but just loud enough to catch my attention. I figured, what the hell? Might as well check it out. I was already working the graveyard shift. Might as well do some exploring. It was strange. No matter where I went, the buzzing never got any louder, nor any quieter. I was stumped. I've scrubbed this building from every square inch, yet couldn't find anything. I was ready to give up my search when I passed Wendell's office. It was completely empty. He was nowhere to be seen. I assumed he had left until I noticed that his coat, bag, and car keys were still on his desk. The buzzing returned, and while it wasn't any louder, I could see flashing lights from underneath his desk. I went in and pushed the desk over to the side, and underneath this was a trap door. The wood was worn down and stained to holy hell, splinters popping up all over the place. I opened the hatch and lifted the door. It led to a long ladder that was rusted and dented. The buzzing returned, this time much louder, along with the screeching. However, this time, it was slurred and mumbled. "Now I can already hear you going, 'Don't go down there, dumbass.' Now I've seen plenty of horror movies, and the whole people being stupid and going into dark basements. But the thing is that the human mind is a curious thing. Sometimes curiosity overpowers logic or fear. So after a few minutes of debating my own sanity, while hearing more yells and buzzing, I went down the ladder. It was grimy and was rusted to hell. Thank God I got my tetanus shot, or I would have died on the spot from the first rung. I continued to go down till my boots hit the cracked cement floor. There were flashing lights in the direction of the sounds. Every part of me wanted to climb back up that ladder and run the fuck out of here. But my body moved no matter how hard I tried to hit the brakes. I went down the hall and slowly peeked around the corner, and what I saw made my heart hit my ass. It was Dr. Wendell's, along with a nurse. Wendell's was standing in front of one of the inmates who had been strapped down to an old-fashioned restraining board like in Frankenstein. The top of the man's skull was cut off. Rusty metal rods railed into his brain from various areas. His eyes were glazed over, almost like TV static. "Now, John, you know this is merely a test. Resistance or not, we will be getting our studies complete, so why don't you just try to relax and we will get through this smoothly," Wendell said, picking up what I assumed to be a cattle prod, or stun baton. He slowly moved the prod to one of the metal rods sticking from the man's brain. It's then when I learned what the buzzing was from. A strong electric current followed by low staticky buzzing. The man began slurring again as his left arm violently began spazzing out. Wendell's began cackling as the nurse also let out this disturbing giggle. "So this part of your brain controls your left arm's motor functions. Fascinating." I screamed silently and kept telling myself to get the fuck out of there, but both my eyes and feet were glued in position. After testing the rest of the rods and discovering what controls were, he called the nurse to bring over his tools. She did just that, and they quickly got to work. Wendell's grabbed a bone drill, caked in stale blood, and began drilling holes in the removed piece of the skull, each hole corresponding with one of the rods. He slowly lowered the removed bone back onto the man's head. He then grabbed a small hand torch. He fucking welded the guy's head back together. The man still let out slurred screams of help, but they were very quiet and mumbled, which I chalked up to the whole metal spears in his brain thing. And now, Wendell said with a twisted ear-to-ear grin as he reached for the tray, we move on to the last step of stage 1. He finished as he picked up another crimson-stained tool. It was a rusty, jagged scalpel, not large enough to be considered a knife, but significantly larger than a simple scalpel. He admired the blade's sharp edges. This is my favorite part, he said with a wink, before ramming the blade into the land's gut, slowly opening it and removing a large patch of flesh, revealing the man's rib cage and the contents held behind it. The man finally went limp as his blank eyes stared off into the dark hallway I had been sitting in. Without a second passing, Wendell's got back to work. He began connecting wires to the various rods in his head, as well as nailing what looked like some kind of power battery into the man's heart. And what happened next has haunted me for years. The cable now attached to the man's brain were attached to a control panel of some kind. And now we begin, Wendell's announced to the nurse by his side. He flipped a few switches and suddenly the man, who was well past deceased, got up from his position. The man made a fucking walking corpse. Magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. Wendell's exclaimed as he continued to test the rest of the controls that caused the dead man's limbs to move. It was absolutely grotesque and honestly horrific, but to that psychopath's credit, despite being an absolute violation of human rights, the man was a smart son of a bitch. If it weren't for the fact that I had seen him gutted with my own eyes, along with the metal rods lodged into his cranium, I could have easily mistaken the man to still be living. His limbs moved flawlessly with little to no difficulty. He was even able to make the corpse pick things up, even move his jaw to give the impression of speaking. That's when my lunch finally decided it was time to come up. That was also the moment I had been spotted thanks to my now liquefied bacon, egg, and cheese spilling to the ground. My eyes met with Wendell's, where he flashed a smile that would have given Heath Ledger's Joker the chills. I immediately began to haul ass to the ladder, in which the doctor's new plaything began to chase me. I turned around, met with his empty, glazed-over eyes and his still-open chest. As I began running, I noticed a large tank of gasoline for the generator that powered Wendell's little torture room. As I ran, I quickly kicked the barrel as hard as I could. Even ended up breaking part of my foot, but my adrenaline was so high, I didn't even notice. I reached the ladder when suddenly my leg was grabbed by the walking corpse. I threw a punch right to his face. Well, I'm sure you know. Dead people don't exactly feel pain, so my swings were meaningless. I decided to shove my boot into his face, which caused him to stumble back, giving me enough time to climb up. As I reached the top, I quickly fished my lighter from my pocket, and for once, having a smoking habit saved my life that night. I dropped my lighter into the hole, and the ground instantly ignited. I pushed the large metal desk back over the trapdoor, in which that fucked up psychologist and his nurse began desperately banging on the steel latch door. I never thought I'd have blood on my hands, but honestly, I couldn't care in the slightest considering whose blood it was. I called the police before quickly running to my truck and driving home fast enough to run over the flash. I haven't been the same since. I mean, fuck. Who would be? I was lucky to make it out alive, but now I am in constant fear of becoming a decaying puppet. After all, despite tearing the whole place apart, the police never found a trace of Wendell's. They had found the nurse's body charred to a crisp. Hey, like I said, I don't have enough sympathy for her to feel guilt, along with the new double dead man, who I did feel bad for. However, Wendell's body was never found. Eden Center looked ancient through my headlights as I pulled into the parking lot, an immensity towering over an ocean of leveled pavement, halos from the lot lights, withering autumn trees. Employee parking looked different at night. Daytime, The place struck me as a tucked-away nook between two anchor stores, but with visibility divided and darkened, it was just wrong. Like driving through a terrible part of town. No light there either, apart from the neighboring truck court. All I knew, there could be a guy crouched behind the dumpster or the strewn assortment of junk the exterior maintenance guy had collected. And what a pile it was. As I parked my car, uncertain whether I'd even got between the faded lines, that junk looked even more astounding. What must have been years' worth of everything from broken chairs to bikes to shattered televisions and plant pots forming this dreary graveyard out of sight and mind, obscured from public view by great brickwork slabs, dividing one anchor store lot from another. This little dump and its little truck court had gotten caught in the middle. I threw the door open, slammed it shut, and dashed for the warm light past the lot and refuge. Still, my guard uniform soaked through in frigid rain by the time the great mauve brick and cement had swallowed me. Truck court smelled of garbage, and for good reason, since waste compactors and various bins found their home here. Ages-old newspaper shreds, soda spills, and cigarette butts had formed a vile topsoil layer above the cement. My boots clung with each step towards the great double doors, and as I used my issued keys to turn the lock and enter, thunder growled through the air alongside a searing flash. Great weather for a first shift. Weaving my way through dusty back corridors with bare cement and yellow drywall, I managed, if only by a vague recollection, to find the break room. I clocked in at 1 a.m. sharp, keying myself into the neighboring security office and paying mine to its unkempt splendor. Either someone had been in a rush to leave, or was just messy and forgetful. Duty boots were there, a half-consumed bag of chips, even a cell phone charging near the computer desk. Not the dedicated security phone either. I'd seen that during orientation, which had been during the day for unknowable reasons. Management said training during midnight hours was an inconvenience, though it threw a question my way surrounding just who'd been the former guard, if anyone was even still filling the shift. Guess my time and a half pay made up for that inconvenience. Still, it didn't give me much faith in the place's management. In this day and age, malls weren't doing the best, but for it to be this decrepit, pretty depressing. Still, I couldn't be one to judge. I'd taken this job for an easy $16 an hour, and even if the place wasn't in the best shape, money was money. Hadn't found myself screwed out of that just yet. At least. As having the security phone on you at all times was mandatory, I found it sequestered between a calculator and a mall rule violation sheet in the office's one desk. Guy before me who'd rushed out before I could relieve him, supposedly a big no-no here, only fit the charging cable half into the port. With the screen protector on it, might have been a little bit more difficult, but unless this guy was just really lazy, he wasn't just in a hurry. He was just plain bolting out of here. I switched on the phone and found 52% battery life and a low-res security badge lock screen greeting me. On the night log app, an orange one called my attention from its smooth little bubble. Your first night was the only document that showed up on the current date. There had been nothing for 3 straight weeks, and before that the logs got wiped or the app just got installed. Out of obligation and admitted curiosity from the caps lock, I opened the document to find some instructions. Then again, maybe some. Probably isn't the best description. Hello, Simon. It's Matt. The note read, "Thank you again for choosing to work for us here at GPL Properties. Like I said in the interview, we've been looking for a competent guy to take care of things at night. The last guy quit on us rather suddenly, but from what I've heard about your work and attendance over at the big mall up north, it's been exemplary. No worries there. Anyhow, aside from what we discussed during your orientation, there are a couple more things I'll detail in this log. As noted in the application, you're free to get homework done between your patrol. Watch a movie if you want on your phone if you're bored. Just make sure you get your rounds in at least every half hour, as this is very important for several reasons. Make absolutely sure all exterior doors get locked properly, and find the temp readings from the boiler room. Considering the number of doors, this may take a while, but I assure you for the safety of everyone involved, It is vital to ensure every single one is taken care of, even the entrance doors. Aside from this, while we don't have interior cameras in this facility, it is very important to monitor the parking lot CCTV units in a timely fashion. The protocol for these is as follows. Between the hours of 12 and 4 a.m., there are no tenants or other persons permitted on site. If you see a figure or entity approaching any of the doors during this time, do not grant them access. After 4 a.m. passes, be certain to inspect every would-be tenant or visitor before allowing them entry. Ask some pertinent questions and do not grant those with black-colored pupils a way in under any circumstance. The last line made me do a double take, but what rattled me more about this was the lack of any further explanation ahead. I heard a metallic grinding sound from an adjacent hall, and while I felt certain of its relation to the pipes or something, the silence that followed, aside from white noise, rain, was deafening. I'd warmed up from the rain now, but an altogether distinct chill, like a cold dead finger, ran its way along the spinal cord. I read on. 2 more final important things. Occasionally, usually around once per hour, you may find 1 or 2 doors you've locked have had their bolts or mechanisms come undone. While we are doing our best to get this issue resolved, for the time being, please do your due diligence to ensure that you secure every door. I want to stress that, especially during this time between 12 and 4, there is nobody related to the facility trying to enter. In the unlikely event you find anyone besides you in the mall, do not call the police. If there is a theft in progress, do not intervene. Your job is strictly to ensure doors remain locked and the facility is running in working order. The local police department has taken issue with the frequent, unnecessary calls we have been sending them in prior months. Do not call 911. Last, ignore any scratching, growling, or whispering sounds you may hear while making rounds. This building is old and settles in noticeable ways, and when mixed in with the various displays and kiosks on the floor and their ambience, it's possible to hear things that just aren't there. As this has been an ongoing and commonly discussed issue, if you feel you are in immediate danger from these sounds, please return to the security office, lock the door, and remain inside for no more than 15 minutes to collect yourself. There is nothing to worry about. This all being said, thank you again for joining the team. If you have questions, please call or text me or Ted during mall hours. We will not be available at night. Have a wonderful, quiet evening, and a happy Halloween. Matt Lowry, Security Director. Something told me I didn't understand the full extent of what I'd signed up to do. Well, it was close to Halloween and all. Playing tricks on a new employee as this bizarre guy did was far from professional. Even though the place, the outfit even, looked far from professional as well. Matt, this Iraq veteran with tattoos and a beard, didn't give me any impression of being a prankster. I caught something in my peripheral vision as I stood there contemplating. A dark, wrong thing my eyes knew was poison. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Raw instinct forced my action. As my head turned, the bones in my neck practically had to snap their way individually into motion. Towards one of the CCTV panels lining the walls, I felt an unknowable sensation. I'd heard descriptions of a sixth sense before. I'd heard vaguely interesting stories about how people knew a sixth sense existed. But not until now did I understand. Could I comprehend? There, motionless upon the grainy black and white flat screen and distorted briefly by a scan line, stood a figure. An outline just inside the truck court light. Truck court number 3. The one I'd entered from. I could make nothing out. No features, no emotions. Nothing. But I knew it was there. I knew it was watching me. Most of us have heard them late at night. The creaks of the floorboards that over time we learned to ignore. It's just the house, is what we tell ourselves, but there's always that small part of us that isn't convinced. like an alarm inside of us that is programmed to go off every time we hear those creaky movements as we lay in bed at our most vulnerable. I was one of you once. Years of hearing these creaks had quietened my creak alarm to the point where I could almost ignore it. I'd hear a creak in the middle of the night, and I wouldn't give it a second thought. It was just background noise. A familiar sound that I had just gotten used to. A familiar sound that no matter where I slept remained familiar. Year after year, night after night, house after house, this sound late at night was always there. It was just a boring Tuesday night. I was laying in bed just scrolling on my phone as the TV quietly played in the background. I was having trouble sleeping for some reason. My mind was racing and I felt restless and on edge. I assumed the phone probably wasn't helping, so I put it down and just listened to the voices on the TV as I tried to drift off. Something I have done for comfort at night for as long as I can remember. So I was laying there, my eyes closed but nowhere near sleeping when I suddenly heard it. A single creak, like something heavy leaning down on the floor outside of my bedroom door. I didn't even budge at this. I was trying to sleep, and it was just a sound I'd heard a million times before. So I continued to lie there with my eyes closed, ignoring the sound and ignoring my internal alarm which had been set off. Moments later there was another creak, only this time it sounded louder, as if something heavy was leaning down on the floorboards inside of my bedroom. I remember thinking to myself how I hate that you always hear every little thing like this in the middle of the night when you're trying to get to sleep. So some time passes. The creaks weren't on my mind at all. I was lying there with my eyes closed and my body still just refusing to shut down. Not only was my mind playing up though, I was getting these tingly sensations all the way up my back. It felt like a feather being lightly dragged from the middle of my back all the way up to my neck, then back down again. It got to the point where it made me shiver, so I pulled up my covers to my neck level so that only my head poked out. Of course, at this point, my ears started to feel tickly. I was growing increasingly frustrated, so I turned to my other side, thinking it might just be the way I was lying down causing the problems. I was lying that way for a few minutes when I heard yet another creaking sound from behind me. I didn't know why, but I shouted, "Fuck off." Not at anything in particular, but basically just at the whole situation. I just wanted to get to sleep, which is exactly what I managed to do. With ease, in fact. There were no creaks. No tingly sensations, and my mind and body seemed to calm down instantly. I slept like a baby. Now, the strangest thing about this, which has played on my mind, is that ever since that night, I have never heard a single creak. Not one. These sounds that I've heard my entire life, almost every night, these sounds that were constantly there just vanished entirely. I've even tested this by staying up all night on a few occasions, to see if it was just a case of me not hearing them, but no, not a peep. Even stranger is that there's other random things that seem to have stopped too. For example, I no longer get goosebumps. It just doesn't happen. I can tickle the hairs on my arm for an hour straight, and they remain completely unmoved. Now, I'm not completely sure what's happened or why the creaking has stopped. What I am sure of is that someone reading this, whether they are in bed now or later, will hear the creaking at night. It could just be the house. Or maybe you're staying at a partner's house and that exact same creaking could just be their house. Or maybe you're at a relative's and you hear this same sound and it's just their house. That sound that you've grown used to, like I once had, that seems to follow you wherever you choose to sleep could just be the house. Then again, it could just be the excuse we all tell ourselves to make it easier to ignore those creaking sounds at night. The first time I heard the screaming, I chalked it up to a prank or an out-of-tune piccolo. The band was rehearsing inside as the weather had turned absolutely hostile. We'd all seen the dark clouds gathering, but they were racing by fast enough that I was hoping the rain would blow right by. Sometimes the band director, you have to make tough calls, and when you're in the final stretch before state competitions and your closer isn't even on the field, well, you tell the woodwinds to leave their instruments somewhere dry because we need the practice. The brass instruments can handle a drizzle, but Woodwinds are a little more delicate to the elements. Besides, there's no hindrance to rehearsal time more personally annoying to me than a clarinet or flute player shrieking and cradling his or her instrument every time a drop of rain even considers falling from the sky. I had miscalculated, unfortunately, and that was why the high schoolers in front of me all looked miserable, soaking wet and shivering and frustrated. Still, even if we couldn't march the show, we needed to make the best of the time we had. I gave the students 10 minutes to get dry as best they could with the least absorbent paper towels money could buy, courtesy of our stingy school board, and then arc up to play through our show. Students grumbled and shot me sour looks while they whispered savagely to one another, but they did as I instructed. Irritation aside, I think they knew what was at stake. Our show was called Convalescence, an ambitious attempt at portraying the effects of a terminal illness on a person's spirit. Currently, we only had 3 songs in the field with marching and music, and the third song was the one that showed the character, represented by a color guard member, at her darkest point through interpretive dance and mournful music. If we didn't get the 4th song on the field, the one with the hopeful resolution, the show would end up having a far more depressing story than I intended. Despite the students' understandable frustration at being made to go out into the elements, they were as dedicated to the show as I was. No one wanted to see it go unfinished at state. The first song was a cheerful tune depicting life before the illness, featuring a piccolo solo from our double senior veteran, Felicity. It was while playing through this tune that I first heard it, a shrill, coarse whine completely out of tune with the rest of the ensemble. I listened for a few seconds, brow furrowing, trying to pinpoint the source before stepping onto the podium and cutting them off with a swipe of my arm. Clarinets, let me hear you in measure 33. They obliged. It wasn't them. Flutes, same place. 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, breathe. Not them either. Okay, very good. I tried not to let my confusion show. Whoever was out of tune must have heard it and made the correction. From the top again. This time I heard the whine before the woodwinds had even lifted their mouthpieces to their lips. Was someone playing a lame prank? My eyes scanned the woodwind sections, the brass, the percussion. No one seemed to be making the noise, nor did they even react to it. Could they not hear it? I became increasingly unnerved as the practice wore on, though I couldn't exactly place why. I began to perspire. My heart raced. I wanted to go into my office and lock the door. I bit back my unease and held it together. That is, until the music stopped. The whine didn't. It lingered in the air for what had to be at least 1 full second after the cutoff from the brass, which was long enough for me to finally place the reason for my sense of disquiet. It was... no. It sounded like a scream. Who was that? Who held over? I asked wildly. The students stared at me silent. This sent me into a near fit of rage. We will sit here in silence and it's time to go if someone doesn't answer me. Felicity, the piccolo player, piped up hesitantly. I didn't hear anyone hold over. Other members of the band nodded. There were a few murmurs of agreement. I felt suddenly lightheaded. How could they not have heard that awful sound? The rest of the afternoon was somewhat of a blur. I remember telling the drum major to continue rehearsal before staggering to my office to collapse at my desk. I could only take so much of hearing the muted whine, intermittently, with the sounds of the band before I put on headphones to drown it out with loud music. It worked, proving something I had already been sure of. The noise was not in my head. I can't remember what I did that night after school, but I know the week passed by as slowly as time has ever dragged. I'd hear it at work, amongst the twangs of guitars and lessons, a band solo during band, a background ringing in my ears in the loud cafeteria. The only time I ever got away from the noise was when I was alone, or I had headphones on to drown it out with Norah Jones blasting at full volume. Followed me like a bad conscience. Always at the back of my mind, even when I could not hear it. I doubt anyone would blame me for taking time off from the school. It was one of the most difficult decisions of my life, but it was becoming too much for my fraying nerves, always trying to pinpoint or ignore that blasted screaming. and it was screaming, that I had become sure of. When I'd heard it enough times in the lapse of silence where it sometimes echoed, its human quality became impossible to ignore. It sounded terrified, or in agony, or both. It was incomparable to any screams I'd heard on television, where the pain wasn't real and the actress was wary of straining her vocal cords. It made me afraid. I thought maybe I was burnt out, despite loving my job, and the screaming was a mental manifestation of my subconscious. After all, I never heard the sound at home, only at the school, around other people. It didn't matter that this explanation didn't make sense considering the noise didn't seem to exist from inside my head. I needed an explanation that made me feel more human and less crazy. Hearing voices, that was something that happened to a crazy person. But anyone can get burnt out. So I decided to take some time to focus on myself and my goals instead of working all day only to retire to an empty apartment. I was lonely, but the dating pool was only so big when your only two hangouts are at work and home. The day that I started my break, I heard the screaming while out shopping for groceries. Its terrified wailing began when I stepped into the bustling store and ended as soon as I closed my car door. Hopeful delusion. Busted. And I didn't even get any food. I thought about reaching out to someone. My mom was undependable and self-absorbed, in the late stages of an addiction that would probably kill her, so she was a no. My dad had left us when I was a toddler, so it hardly felt appropriate to search him up on Facebook. I had no siblings and no friends outside of work. I lost touch with my college friends practically the day we graduated. A psychologist? I didn't want to consider that. Not yet. I felt like I should handle this myself. My self-inflicted social isolation may have been the very reason I was such an easy target. I began holing up in my apartment, only going outside if the piles of garbage inside demanded to be fed to the dumpster via the door. My upstairs neighbors sometimes threw parties. I would hear that muffled screaming amongst the sounds of laughter and the vibrations of a subwoofer. I'd bang on the ceiling with a broom and shout at them, but I would always give up and sink back into the safety of my headphones under heavy blankets or warm bath water. Other than this, life carried on with only the rarest instances where the familiar screaming could be heard. Human beings can get used to almost anything, and I'd gotten used to the loneliness and squalor of my living arrangements in order to get away from the damn noise. I no longer cared about anything except maintaining my peace and quiet. I shouldn't have been alone. Maybe it was a planned abduction. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. All I know is that I was heaving my black garbage bag full of Uber Eats takeout into the trash. The screaming suddenly returned, the loudest I'd ever heard it. Before I could so much as turn around, something struck me on the back of the head and I woke up here. The screams have been filling this basement for hours now. Still no one can hear them, except my captor. Because the screams are now coming from me. I don't know how long I have. The smell of rot, bodily fluids, and blood are ever present. I know that if I let my eyes adapt to the dark, I may be able to make out what else is in this room with me. Who else? I try to keep my head down and focus on writing my testimony. I don't want to see what fate awaits me. As I write my story to you with the dwindling fragments of daylight reaching me through cracks in a boarded-up window, I beg you not ignore the signs like I did. If you hear the screams, don't run from them. Stay in large groups. Never find yourself alone or vulnerable. You'll feel crazy, but it's better than the fate that awaits you. No one heard my screams then, so I doubt they will hear me now. I have no doubt that I'm not the only one having issues with getting mail and packages to my house right now. Honestly, given the world's current state, it is somewhat astonishing that anybody is getting any mail at all. So I was not remotely surprised when I found myself calling yet another customer service number to report a missing package. I dialed the 1-800 number, stomach coiled with the tension of coming battle. 3 rings later, the computer woman picked up. A cheerful, "Thank you for calling," blah blah blah, and a Your call may be recorded to ensure... Warning. I dropped my head against the back of the chair, impatient. For help with an order, press 1. To report a missing package, press 6. Please stay on the line while you are connected with a customer care representative. Wait times are expected to be under 10 minutes. I groaned and dropped the phone in my lap after hitting speakerphone and proceeded to depress myself with browsing news headlines on my computer. For several minutes, I absently rocked my head back and forth to the terrible, tinny music coming through my phone. I jumped as a loud crunch of static cut through the music. I stared down at my phone in confusion just as the upbeat music returned. Good grief, I muttered and went back to the news. Jesus, I shouted, jumping again at the nearly deafening crash of static emanating from my phone. The static quieted, and for a second, everything was silent. The music returned, sort of. It was like a music box with someone holding the winding key back, sluggish and wrong. It continued for a few moments before it began to distort, all of the notes sounding flat, almost like they were beginning to melt. Slight bits of static began layering over the music, disconcertingly. Like a complete moron, I just stared at my phone, dumbfounded. An exasperated sigh came through the phone just as all the sounds suddenly stopped. Hello, this is... Thank you for your call. Care service. At this point, I fumbled to turn off the speakerphone and returned it to my ear, hoping to improve the call quality. Yes, I would like to report a missing package, I said uncertainly, hoping he could hear me. Oh, sorry to hear that. Through the static came a young man's voice who did not sound sorry to hear it at all. Can you give me your name? I pull up the order? I did so, spelling it out afterwards. Thank you. Please give me just a minute while I look. Stay on the line. With another deep sigh, the horrible din of distorted music and static returned. Wincing, I held the phone several inches from my ear. I leaned my head back again and let an achingly long minute of this pass before the voice came back in a crinkling of particularly loud static. Thank you for holding. Another long sigh. Having a bit of a problem finding you in our system. Can you confirm your address for me? I gave him my address, being as clear as I could. Thank you. That should help. Stay on the... The horrendous noise returned before he was even done talking, and I yanked the phone from my ear as fast as I could, gritting my teeth in irritation. The wait was mercifully shorter this time. The man's voice returned in a flurry of static as he slowly said, Found you. Feeling thoroughly creeped out at this point, I chuckled awkwardly and responded with a half-hearted yay. So, options are a refund. Was I losing my mind, or could I faintly hear the horrid, distorted music under his voice? I'll just take a refund, thanks. Excellent choice. I froze in sudden icy terror. That voice had not, in fact, come through the phone at all. It had come from right outside my front door, not 10 feet from where I sat. I was paralyzed, picturing the large window on the door that gave anyone outside an unfortunately good view into my living room, with me in it, sitting with my back to the door. All the hairs on my body stood up as I tried to force myself to turn and look at the door. Bang. I nearly jumped out of my skin before realizing that in my fear I had dropped my phone to the floor. The spell of horror now broken. I whipped around to stare at my front door. No one was standing in the window. Cautiously, I made my way across the door and peered out into the fading light. There was not a soul in sight. With much trepidation and cursing myself as a damn fool, I unbolted the door and stepped out, looking around. As my foot hit the welcome mat, I felt something else there. Something. Paper. An envelope lay on the welcome mat, perfectly centered, with my name written in flowing cursive facing me. Shocked, I picked it up and opened it. Dearest customer, we are sorry that you have had cause to call our customer care team due to this tragically misplaced package. Upper management has been made aware of the situation and you can rest assured this will not go unpunished. As you have wisely requested, a refund will be sent to this address in 3 to 5 business days. If you have any further issues, do not hesitate to contact us again. Thank you. When I shakily made my way back inside, double locking the door, I found my phone halfway under the chair. The call had apparently been ended. In fact, according to my phone, the call never took place as it is not on my call history. I have spent the last 4 days locked in my house, jumping at every loud noise and expecting imminent doom. A couple times I swear I could have seen people standing on the street staring at my house only to have them continue on when they notice me. But now, this one won't go away. I have been checking regularly for the last couple of hours in mounting horror. He is standing directly in front of the door right now watching me, unblinking, holding a large, blood-covered package. I think I'm getting my refund. My reflection isn't me anymore. It wasn't instant. I started to notice that the person in the mirror wasn't me anymore. It looked like me, but it started not to sound like me and move like me anymore. I don't like looking at mirrors anymore. I don't like passing by them, and I don't like having to hear my own voice. If I could be silent for the rest of whatever time I have left, then I would hope so. But not all of us are so lucky. One day, I went home smoking a cigarette. I don't know how many I had that day. I don't count anymore. I start counting after I start feeling a bit relaxed. I went in front of the mirror. I had the cigarette, but it wouldn't appear in the mirror. That's where it started. Small things like that. Then I noticed my reflection could move better. It was almost superhuman compared to me. It could move so fast. I would see it against fleeting car windows, glass panes in the gym, or anywhere else. My reflection was a beast physically. My reflection smile was starting to get a whole lot better than mine. It was getting eerie, really. I didn't know how it was managing to smile better than I ever could. Its pearly white smiling at just the right spot, such that it didn't look too happy, but it didn't look too forced as well. The part that might creep you out, and believe me, I'm telling the truth. In restaurants, in malls, wherever there were glass panes and mirrors, I started to notice that my reflection was better at socializing too. He knew just when to smile, when to laugh, knew what was socially acceptable to do and what wasn't. I couldn't always see my reflection, but I'm pretty sure that at this point, my reflection could drive better, could walk better, talk better, could dress better, and do everything better than I could. It was pretty cool. Seeing another version of me be able to do all that, I at least knew that it was possible. Somewhat. It was weird. My reflection is supposed to be me, but I'm convinced it isn't me anymore. My reflection never holds a cigarette or a bottle of alcohol whenever I do. Yet I know deep inside I've smoked dozens, drank till my throat begged me not to. My lungs were blackening underneath that white smile and that confident posture. My reflection never missed a beat when socializing with people. Yet I knew that deep inside, I was 3 seconds away from collapsing and clinging to my chest. How could he do it so well? How could my reflection be so good at taking care of himself? My reflection never went over the speed limit. My reflection always drove like it was his first time. But I swear I had memories of my hand twitching and all my willpower needed not to drive into the wall. How was my reflection such a good driver? I wish he could talk to me and teach me. My reflection smiles in a way that I wish I could smile every time. It makes me want to snap 1,000 pictures and use them for Instagram posts. But I know I can never smile like my reflection does. He gets it so right, so perfectly. I don't know how to do it, and if I could only speak to him, he'd teach me how. My reflection isn't me anymore. I'm convinced of it. He's better at everything, and he never brags about it. He never looks at me with pity or with a condescending look. He just looks at me, So happy all the time, so genuine, so cheerful, and so empathetic. I wonder if he knew that I wished with all my heart I could be him. Then one day, I got my wish. I spoke to him, out of thin air and desperation. I was thinking out loud. Perhaps it was the drugs, the alcohol, or everything in between, but my reflection smiled back at me. It was a perfect smile, a genuine smile, a smile that I knew in my heart I could never replicate. I miss you, I whispered. I wish I could be like you, just once. Oh, but you were, my reflection whispered back, his voice not raspy. How could it be? It wasn't monotone. It was the perfect pitch with the perfect smile. You were in so many different ways, he said. My reflection isn't me anymore, and I know that I'll never be like my reflection. I smiled to myself. The engine of my car steadily rumbled on, the rumble of duty and readiness that I was so familiar with. I looked down at my palm. I took the pills and I gulped. I gulped hard. I looked up at my reflection. He was there once more. He had smoother skin, gentler eyes, and better hair. He smiled one last time. A smile that I just know would have melted so many hearts if only other women could see his smile like that. A single tear streaked down his cheek. Perfection. Not ugly, but genuine. It was a real tear. Just a dash of vulnerability that made him that much more likable. I heaved a sigh and leaned back in my car seat. A weight was lifted off my chest. My reflection isn't me anymore. He's so much better. And I know he can continue all this for me. I closed my eyes and let reassuring chill creep through my body, and the darkness coat my eyes that were, oh, so tired and painful. I shouldn't have played this game. I knew I wasn't in a good spot mentally and spiritually to do it, but I still did it. Why? It genuinely sparked my interest. I've heard and read of so many types of games and rituals throughout my 22 years of living, and I always warned to never play them or take part in them no matter what. But I, for some reason, was drawn to play Three Kings. It took a minute, but I got my roommate to agree to be my other person during the game. In fact, I'm surprised he said yes at all. He's just not the type to mess with this kind of stuff, you know? There wasn't a good spot in our apartment to do this, so we went to my parents' house. More specifically, the basement, when I knew for sure they wouldn't be home. I think maybe I should mention that a bunch of strange things happened to me in the basement as a kid. I always saw things, heard things, felt weird overall whenever I was down there. I don't know. I just thought it was worth mentioning. But anyway, imagine a traditional Hispanic mom finding out her daughter was about to participate in something that could potentially invite unwelcome visitors in her house. I made sure to tell my parents I was going home to do laundry and that I would leave right after so they wouldn't think much of it. Everything was set up around 11:10 p.m., and after that, I decided to try and get some sleep before my alarm would ring at 3:30 a.m. My roommate stayed up watching TV since he's been having some issues falling asleep lately. My alarm went off at 3:30, and I was careful to not instinctively turn on any lights and only the candle. I grabbed my power item, which is my stuffed bunny plushie I found at my door wrapped with no card or anything at my 6th birthday party. That's a whole other story. I almost felt like a fearful child walking in the dark with only a candle for light in one hand and my bunny in the other. I stopped for a split second. What am I doing? I quickly shrugged off that wave of hesitance and continued down to the basement before time was up. My roommate noticed me walking down the stairs and followed, but only stayed at the top. I walked down the stairs and turned out of sight into the first room of the basement, hoping the door I had previously left open was suddenly closed so I could abort mission, but alas, it was still open and it led to the second room in the basement where everything was set up. I walked into the second room and immediately my instincts went absolutely feral. I felt something or someone in the room with me. There was most definitely a presence in there. I made it to my seat, and I stared straight ahead into the darkness, trying to chill out because I'm truly terrified of the dark, regardless of whether or not I was playing this game. I sat for a few minutes with nothing but silence, and only the subtle noise made by the flickering candle. I could see my reflections in my peripheral, and I could tell they were moving around a lot. It wasn't the flickering of the candle that made them move. No, they were moving, and I could feel myself start to tremble. I had the urge to look into the mirrors just to see what was going on, but I didn't. And to be quite honest, I'm shocked I didn't. I continued to stare straight ahead into the darkness for what seemed like forever, and eventually, the movement in my peripheral started to slow down, and when I thought it was over, it wasn't. Suddenly the feeling of a presence. No. More than one presence filled the room, and my instincts were begging me to move my body so the fan would let the flame of the candle go out. I should have listened to them, but maybe the reason I didn't listen to my instincts was because instead, I was listening to the faint whispers coming from either side of me. The whispers started to get a little louder. I could tell they were arguing with each other. It was weird. I could hear them clear as day, but I couldn't make out what it was they were actually saying. I continued sitting still, scared, but also confused. What do I do? Do I speak? Is it wise to interrupt their argument? I did it anyway. I felt I was spiraling out of control, and I needed to know what was going on, who they were, what they're talking about. "Who's there?" I asked. "It's me, silly." The voice on the left spoke. It was almost childlike. It sounded playful. "It's just you?" The voice on the right said. This voice sounded mature, and almost annoyed even. I clenched my teeth. These voices were mine. Just different variations of it, I guess. I kinda just sat there while the two voices continued arguing. It was mostly the left child voice, demanding the right voice to acknowledge the fact that they were also there, that it wasn't just me. The right voice maintained its ground and said it was just me and that they needed to stop messing around and stop trying to get me to look. The left voice then suddenly spoke directly to me. "I'm serious. I'm here too. They're the one trying to trick you, not me. How could I? We're so alike, you and me." I was about to turn and look, but I stopped dead in my tracks. I can't look. For some reason, I remembered when I was about 16 I read about lucid dreaming, and that you shouldn't look into a mirror while doing so because it can induce a nightmare or something like that. I wasn't sure if this was anywhere similar to that, but I decided to keep looking straight ahead, just in case. "Good. You are smart. Despite you being here, don't listen to her. Don't do as she says. You know better," the right voice told me. "Were you? It's fine if you don't understand, but I think you do. Why are you doing this? You knew this wasn't a good idea. I tried to warn you, but I guess you continue only listening to her. That needs to change soon. It's okay to be curious. You always have been, and you've been good at knowing where the curiosity should stop. But you need to do better. You need to get it together. I know you're scared, but you need to grow up." With that, the left voice began yelling, still trying to get validation from the other voice, and me, I suppose. The two voices began arguing again, but this time the left voice began getting louder and louder, demanding me to look over at it, all while threatening to expose some of my secrets to everyone close around me. I was hoping the other voice would reassure me again, but all I could hear was the left. The right was gone. I could feel it. My head turned and I looked at the left mirror. "Made you look." I couldn't help but stare. I could see that the right mirror was shattered. When the hell did it shatter? I didn't hear it. I started to panic, but I just couldn't look away, and then it's almost like a maniacal version of me began laughing, and it started coming out of the mirror. I snapped out of it and moved my body to get to the fan to blow the flame out, and ran as fast as I could out of the room. I felt my foot bump into the bucket of water in front of me, and felt my socks get wet as the water began leaking onto the floor. I didn't care. I ran into the first room, attempting to close the door behind me, to the second room, and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. "Did you not hear that? Why didn't you come check on me?" I snapped at my roommate, who was still sitting at the top of the stairs. "I did. I went down there to check, and I asked if you were fine, and you were smiling at me, and you kept telling me you were fine, to come back upstairs and wait for you. You said it was fun, so I thought you were good," he yelled back. I stood there, out of breath from running. No, he didn't. He never went down there. I never saw him, nor did I ever speak to him. I apologized for snapping at him and told him that I didn't remember seeing him downstairs or even talking to him. He looked a bit disturbed and backed away a bit, and said he was going to drive back to the apartment. I don't blame him. Maybe I should have gone too. I stayed behind though. I said it was fun. I was smiling. Honestly, it didn't sound like me, but I truly don't remember seeing him or talking to him. I didn't sleep the rest of the night nor the next day. I think my insomnia got triggered. It's been a couple of days since the whole thing happened. My roommate and I are on good terms again, but I can tell he's a bit wary and cautious around me. I want to ask why, but at the same time, I think I don't want to know. Maybe he's still kind of annoyed with me for yelling at him. Honestly, I hope that's the case. I shouldn't have played this game. I've always avoided these kinds of things, so what on earth made me decide to play this stupid game? Something is off with me. I can feel it. I feel more paranoid than usual. I feel more cautious and I keep seeing things and feeling things around me more than usual. I'm going home soon to check if anything feels off back there. If there is, I'm coming clean with my parents. I don't want anything to happen to them. I'm so dumb. I seriously shouldn't have played this game. There's something terrifying going on in the restaurant downtown. I could give you the address, could tell you the exact location, could give you turn-by-turn directions on how to get there, but I won't. I'll describe how it looks, so you can turn away if you ever stumble on it by accident, but that's all I'll do. I'd rather not have any of you trying to find the place. The restaurant I am talking about is a run-down part of my hometown. It's in the kind of neighborhood that consists mainly of closed-up shops. Their dusty windows blocked over with old newspapers and cardboard. There are only two kinds of businesses that seem to survive in that place. There are filthy bars lined with slot machines on one hand, and on the other are the sort of second-hand electronic stores that seem to only exist so pickpockets can get rid of stolen cell phones. I used to take a shortcut through this district on my way home from my part-time job. Normally there was little to see. Or rather, what there was to see was either gross or concerning, if not both. So you were better off not paying any attention in the first place. On this particular day several months ago, however, an illuminated window caught my eye. A simple tablecloth behind a dirty window. It was the bright white color that did the trick. Nothing really special, you may think, and you'd be right. But its pristine condition stood out in a place like this, where an all-encompassing patina of filth was an expected part of any decor. The window belonged to a two-story house wedged in between some taller buildings. Graffiti covered its walls to an extent that rendered it barely recognizable as a restaurant. Once its name must have been painted onto the wall above the window. Now only a few faded letters remain legible. D-A-I-S-T-R-O was all I could make out. I guess that the second used to be bistro. No idea about the first one. Upon taking a closer look through the illuminated window, I spotted a laid table housing a single lone customer. There were other tables and chairs haphazardly littered around the room, but this central one was the only table sporting a bright white tablecloth and a guest. Various pots and pans were strewn about on its surface. The air above was filled with the soft, foggy steam of freshly cooked food. There was a lot of it, far too much for the lone patron. He was a skinny man with worn clothes that seemed far too big for him. His cheeks looked hollow and his arms spindly. Maybe part of the local population of homeless drifters and addicts. Definitely not the kind of person who might be able to afford a meal of this size. He was facing my direction without ever looking directly at me or the window in general. His attention was completely focused on the food. He shoveled a spoon filled with mashed potatoes and green beans into his mouth before grasping the nearby glass of water to flood the generous portion down his throat. There was an obvious appetite in the way he hungrily wolfed down anything he could get his hands on, and the longer I stared at the simple but generous meal, the more I started to grow hungry myself. For a minute or two, I fruitlessly walked back and forth in front of the place, searching for a way to enter. The only visible door was closed, and it didn't look like an entrance in the first place. It was a plain steel door sporting an electric warning sign. After returning to the window one last time, I gave up, went home, and proceeded to forget about the whole encounter. I didn't think about it at all until I passed by the window again the week after. As soon as I caught a glimpse of the white color, the memory came flooding back. The very same man was still there, or more likely was there again, and once more he sat there in front of a lavish meal. A sweaty gleam was covering his face, and I could see the muscles in his neck tense and twitch whenever he swallowed. The only thing that had really changed from the week before was the food. The simple mix of potatoes, soups, and steamed vegetables had been replaced by more intricate and expensive meals. Plates housed nicely arranged cutlets of various meats, each artfully drenched in a different sauce and adorned with a few herbs. With a twist of his wrist, the patron scooped up a serving of thin, delicate noodles, dripping with olive oil and roasted garlic. He squeezed the fork against his lips, his jaw still trying to chew the previous load, then opened his mouth and shoved the noodles in, nearly choking in the process. He looked slightly distressed as he tried to swallow the portion while his hands were already scooping up the next load. A tender piece of chicken breast from its roast, dipped in brown marinade. He slightly shuddered as he forced the food down, took a second to sip on a glass of red wine, then went back to stuffing himself. I watched him for 5 minutes before moving on. The scent drifting through the window was enticing, but I had already given up on the notion of finding an entrance to the building. When I came home, I emptied my pantry and cooked myself a giant meal as well. The next time I came back to the restaurant wasn't by chance. Something about the whole place had piqued my interest, and I was looking forward to seeing whether the same singular customer had returned for a third time. To my disappointment, something was blocking the view that particular night. A board of some sort was propped against the window from the inside. I could still see parts of the room through a small gap. I could see the light was still burning, and that somebody appeared to be still sitting at the place the man had been those last 2 weeks. But there was no way of getting a good look at what was going on. With my curiosity left unsatisfied, I went home. The next day I made a detour to return. I just hated to be left hanging like that. The window was blocked again. Over the next few weeks, I'd develop a habit of dropping by the place every now and then. Sometimes the window was blocked. Sometimes I got a good view into the room. Whenever I did, I'd find the same sight. The skinny man sitting in front of increasingly luscious meals, gorging himself on the food. By now, you couldn't really call him skinny anymore, though. He had gained at least a little weight. His cheeks were no longer sunken in, and his formerly loosely hanging vest had grown a bit tighter around the waist. While he had eaten with a healthy appetite at first, his expression had turned slightly pained by now. Every bite had become a struggle. Every motion seemed forced. His nose wrinkled in disgust every time his lips opened. Still, he kept eating. I have to admit, however, that I didn't pay all that much attention to him. The increasingly exotic food was just too bizarre to look away from. Every time I was allowed a glimpse at the table, I'd see more and more alien items appearing in more and more strange arrangements. Jelly cubes encasing sharp-fanged anglerfish, misshapen eggs the size of my fist emitting a faint glow, noodles so thin and dark they looked like hair. It became hard to even recognize half of the stuff as edible in the first place. I watched the man crack open the gigantic body of a purple spider crab, watched him bite down on moss-covered mushrooms that spat out clouds of yellow spores with every touch, witnessed him sitting in front of a plate of little squirming black bugs that tried to flee from his spoon as he shoveled them into his maw. Giant algae plants shaped and twisted around each other like strands of DNA. Needle-covered orange balls that slightly shivered as if breathing. The roasted body of some 8-legged animal, either the remnants of some freak of nature or several animals stitched together to create a new, abnormal shape. Soon I ignored the patron completely and just dropped by to see what kind of absurd ideas the cook had come up with this time. And strangely, no matter how bizarre and abhorrent the food looked, it left me wanting to try it myself. It left me hungry and searching for something to fill myself as well. And then when I finally returned home to plunder my kitchen, I'd end up unsatisfied. As time passed, my chances to catch a glimpse at the goings-on inside the restaurant grew rarer. More and more often the window was blocked, and I was relegated to squeezing my head against the corner in hopes of at least catching a little glance at that day's special. Mince meat shaped to resemble realistic human heads, with hairs and teeth taken from various animals. A thin glass that emitted a seemingly endless stream of bluish fog. A red soup that followed the motions of the spoon before it ever came into contact, as if driven by some magnetic force. By now I can't believe that I never noticed anything being wrong with these things when witnessing them. But back then I kept telling myself that there existed a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of this. That everything I saw were just tricks, manufactured by some creative and probably slightly deranged cooking genius. But this little lie I kept telling myself could only get me so far. It was only a matter of time until the strangeness crossed a threshold. That's what happened last week. Things just got a little too weird to ignore and mentally push aside. There's something wrong with that place. There is something terrifying about the restaurant downtown. Before the day in question, I hadn't gotten a clear view into the restaurant for a month. Just little hints here and there, but never enough to leave me satisfied. And on that day, finally, the window was free again. The moment I stepped closer, this joyful excitement I felt turned into a subtle horror. There was only a single item lying on the table. It looked like the carcass of a large stag at first glance, a four-legged animal with short reddish-brown fur and huge dark antlers. At second glance, the alterations that had been done to the creature were unmistakable. I say alterations because I refuse to believe that a thing like this could come out of any natural process. It must have been crafted artificially, maybe taxidermized, out of different animals. If so, then the creator of this monstrosity did a perfect job of blending the various parts into one seamless whole. Instead of hooves, the stag was sporting 4 hands, like those of an ape or some similar primate, wrinkled and calloused, but hands nonetheless. Its face, too, was not that of a deer. The nose was flat and thin, the mouth large and adorned with human-like lips, its skin around these parts hairless and flesh-colored. A large hole had been torn into its side. Broken ribs were sticking out. Blackish blood darkened the fur around the open wound. The man was leaning over the carcass, his mouth stained with the dark red color of blood as well. Some entrails were hanging between him and the corpse, and with the motion of his head, he slurped them down as if they were spaghetti. He had changed completely. His formerly lithe body was now encompassed by layers of fat. His eyes had turned into beady black holes, almost as if they had retreated into his skull. His clothes, now ill-fitting in a completely different way, had burst in several places, revealing the hairless, greasy pale skin underneath. He looked less like a man and more like a giant maggot. The way his neck had swollen to the size of his shoulders, the way his arms barely peeked out of the armor of fat surrounding him. And then he looked up, looked away from the meal for the first time and straight at me. There was nothing but a deep and bottomless hunger. Saliva gathered in the corner of his mouth. His gaze wandered up and down my body. He licked his lips. I turned and left. It took some force of will not to run, but I managed to keep walking at a slow and steady pace. Maybe running would have been an appropriate response to being looked at like that. But at that moment, I was still trying to hold on to reason, was trying to find logical explanations, was trying to laugh all of this off. Maybe I was just confused. Maybe this was a completely different customer. Surely the blind hunger in his eyes wasn't actually targeted at me. But nothing could quench the growing unease and fear in the back of my mind. I didn't want to go back. Didn't want to be forced to look at this creature ever again. But I had to. I just needed to make sure the man was still there, locked in the room, just one last time. When I returned today, my worst nightmares had come true. The man was gone. The table was empty. The metal door with the electrical warning sign stood open, leading into the room, and an enticing smell floated through the air towards me. Despite all I had witnessed, I found myself taking a step towards the opening. Before I could take another, something heavy moved in a nearby alley. Some street cat let out a startled scream that was cut short. A moment later, there the sound of cracking and munching echoed from the buildings. This time, I did run. I will not return to this place ever again. I will not return to this place of the city ever again. I'm even making plans to move far away. The scent that drifted out of the open door is still stuck in my nose, and no food I touch can satisfy my growing appetite. And then there is one detail about tonight that keeps popping back into my mind. Right next to the open door, somebody had propped up a simple blackboard. It read, "Today's special, all you can eat." Yesterday I bought a laptop from one of those Facebook buy and sell groups. The person who listed it said that they just moved into an older house that had been vacant for years. They found this computer among the many other items the previous owner must have left without. From the seemingly never-ending posts in the Cellar tab of Facebook, it seemed to me like the previous owner had walked out without any of his belongings. Anyway, they plugged it in and it turned on. So they sold it to me for $150. That isn't why I am reaching out to you all today. When I arrived back home from picking it up, I found it in the state that they told me it was in. It had a nice layer of dust over everything, but when I opened the lid, the screen instantly turned on to the login screen. To my luck, it only took a bit of cleaning because there was no password that I had to try to crack or get around. Last night, I started the process of clearing everything on the computer so I could eventually fix it up more and sell it for a lot more than I paid. But hey, I am a 22-year-old man with nothing to do now that we are locking back down again here in Pennsylvania. So it is only normal that I was poking around before deleting everything, right? The computer was filled with pictures. Most of them featured a tall, thin, blonde man on a number of different hiking trails. Some of them showcased holiday gatherings, family get-togethers, and huge tables overflowing with food. It was almost comforting to see since it had been such a long time since I've been able to see my own family. Through nearly 600 photos, I was able to feel like I knew the previous owner of the computer. He was an adventurous man who had a love for food, his family, the outdoors, and dogs. After a little bit more poking around, I learned that his name was Jason Beckett. I wish I would have stopped there. I wish I would have learned his name and then proceeded to clear the hard drive. If I had, I would not be here now typing this out in the middle of the night, hoping that he, or someone that knows him, finds this and can provide some answers. The last thing that I found myself clicking on was the media tab on the computer. If I could go back and stop myself, I would. The video that I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The semi-blurry quality of the video, and the way that it was positioned in his arms, I knew that the video was being recorded right from the laptop. He looked sweaty. His chest was moving quickly with the fast and deep breaths that he was taking right at the start after I hit the play button. It started with a quick flash of movement before it settled on his face as he was moving quickly across the room. The sound of a door slamming and locking could be heard before he made his way back across the room and then finally spoke. As he spoke, he sat the computer down on what must have been a desk and settled into a chair. It is 3:14 a.m. on November 14th, 2017. His voice was shaking, and he kept throwing his head back to look over the shoulder at the door that he just locked. He reached over the computer to turn on a lamp, and then light flooded onto the small room where he was sitting. He's back. The look on his face as he said those words were nothing I could explain other than pure terror. He brushed his hair back over his forehead and leaned too close to the computer for comfort. Can you hear him? His voice broke off at the end in what could have been a sob, or just another sharp breath. Can you hear him? Can you hear him? He repeated the words over and over again, his voice sounding more and more desperate each time. That's when the rambling started. I don't know if he was even talking to the video at this point, or if he was just talking to himself. I did what they said. I sealed off the room. I boarded it up. I covered the whole thing. I locked it in. I locked it in. I locked it in. He was not even facing the camera at this point. He had his eyes locked on the door. When he finally fell silent, a new sound could be heard. Dull thuds. Footsteps. Was he kicking the desk? I guess I'll never know. But that was not the only thing. A scraping sound, like something was being dragged against the wall or the floor. The man in the video still sat still, silent, and with his gaze locked on the door across the room. There was no one else there. What could that dragging sound have been? The last part of the video is hard to watch. The lamp behind the computer begins to flicker. This seems to set him off. Jason jumps up, knocking the computer to the side just a little so it is settled looking at the door instead of him. The sound of the chair being knocked back and crashing to the floor is all that can be heard for a second. But then the pounding starts. The door begins to shake as loud bangs fill the room. As if the shaking of the door and the banging were not haunting enough. That is when the screaming started. It started out as a low groaning sound, a mix between a groan in pain and the growling of a cat, but within seconds it was all that could be heard. Deafeningly loud screeching that made nails on a chalkboard sound like classical music. Then Jason. No, I did what they said. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. His screams were horrifying. This is how I knew if it was staged, this man needs to win every award out there. It was haunting. Too sincere to be faked. Someone help me. He's here. He's here. The door was almost off the hinges at this point. With every slam against the door, it was just seconds away from breaking in. I sat there frozen, my eyes glued to the door as I heard the screeching of whatever was outside the door and the man's pleas for help. After a few more agonizing seconds, the door flew from the hinges and into the room, crashing against the floor. The light from the hallway poured into the room, and just like the lamp behind the computer, it was flickering almost out of control at this point. I flinched back, expecting to see the person that Jason was screaming about, but there was no one there. For a few seconds, it was just that. The camera recording the empty doorway and the eerie silence. Seconds dragged on and they felt like hours. Glued to the screen, I didn't know if I should slam the screen shut or keep watching to wait for the haha gotcha moment. But it never came. Instead, Jason's frantic whisper started again. No. The words started running together at the end as if his breathing picked up speed again. Leave me alone, he screamed. That's when I saw it. A huge black shadow was moving down the hall. It wasn't like it was something that was casting a shadow, but like the whole being was the shadow. It crept down the hallway in jerky, unnatural motions. Like it glitched with every step it took. It took almost a minute to reach the door, and when it reached the door, it paused. Jason was screaming at it to leave him alone, but it did not seem to be even hearing him. After pausing the doorway for what seemed like forever, the shadow moved with impossible speed and crossed the room to where Jason must have been faster than my eyes could even register what happened. More horrifying screams filled the room as the shadow moved back into view of the camera. Its jerky way of walking was back as it made its way, much slower this time, back towards the door. The only thing different was that it was now dragging a frantic and screaming Jason across the floor by his leg. The way he was screaming and reaching out for anything he could possibly get his hands on was haunting. The sounds of his screams will never leave my mind. I watched in absolute horror as the thing made it to the doorway and crossed through the frame where the door once stood. Right before they disappeared out of view, the shadow turned and looked directly at where the laptop was sitting. Right then, whatever that thing was turned to face the camera. It disappeared with one last haunting scream from Jason, and the video ended abruptly in an explosion of static across the screen. I am pleading with anyone who might know what this was. Was this some short clip movie that never got published? I don't think so. Jason, I'm praying for you. When my wife and I first moved into this house, the previous owner left a friendly note on the counter. It basically said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Here's some local coffee shops. Here's the number for the utilities." A lot of sellers don't do this, so it was a nice gesture. The last line was unusual, though. It just said, "Oh, and don't worry about restocking the wine cellar." What did that mean? It sounded like a cute joke, but we didn't really get it. The wine cellar was really just a closet downstairs next to the garage. It was outfitted with racks and a thermostat. After reading the note, We went downstairs and lo and behold, the wine cellar was still full. The previous owner must have left it all. We had paid well above market value for the place, so we assumed it was a housewarming gift, and they were saving themselves the hassle. And what a collection. There were bottles that were decades old in there from all over the world. In fact, we couldn't find a bottle that was under 30 years old. This collection must have been worth a small fortune. We grabbed a bottle and headed upstairs to celebrate the purchase and their generosity. A toast to the beginning of a new chapter of our lives. A lovely wine. It didn't last long. The next morning I poked my head in the cellar to see what else was in there. Weirdly enough, I couldn't find the empty rack where we'd taken the bottle from the previous night. Every slot on the rack was occupied. Every bottle full. I quizzed my wife about it, and she said she hadn't replaced it. Maybe it was a double stack. We looked in the recycling, and the empty bottle was missing too. I opened my phone since I remembered texting a picture of the bottle to a friend of ours. There it was in my camera roll. A bottle from 1973 from a vineyard in Argentina. We chalked it all up to the zaniness of moving in. Then it happened again and again. We would pull a bottle, drink it, and the next morning the cellar appeared untouched, and the empty bottle was missing. At this point, we were creeped out. I tried reaching out to the previous owner, but they didn't return my calls. Without many other leads, I started Googling the vineyards on the bottles. No results. Not a single vineyard had a web page, phone number, or even a passing reference in a wine forum. We felt like we were losing our minds. We sure as hell knew we weren't going to drink any more of that wine. I pulled every bottle out of there and put them in boxes in the hallway. I set up a camera on the boxes and the empty wine cellar, and then I waited. The next morning, the cellar was full and the boxes empty. I felt like we should call someone, but who the fuck do you call about this? If anything, the cops would think it was a prank. Oh, your wine cellar refills itself. Oh no. I pulled the memory cards out of the camera and started scrubbing through the exact moment the wine moves. I finally find something. At 1:45 a.m., the camera flickers and the image distorts. The sounds of glass breaking maxes out the mic so loud I tear my headphones off. It's so loud, almost like the bottle is screaming. On screen, each bottle explodes, throwing splatters of red wine against the wall. It looks like something out of a crime scene. I open my web browser. I Google the name of the vineyards again, but this time without the words vineyard or wine or estates. Just the names. Now I get results. It's all missing persons, and the years they went missing, all more than 30 years ago. Honestly, I think I suppressed this memory for my own sake. When I think back, the only reason I forgot about it was to deal with what was happening around me. Last week I remembered it all. I wish I would have thought ahead of time instead of years later and in the moment, because now I'm screwed. Ever since I was young, we lived in a fairly decent-sized neighborhood. Even though it was pretty big, everyone knew everyone. Every kid knew every other kid, and every parent knew every other parent. Sleepovers and cookouts were so frequent. To an outsider, it probably looked like we were all one giant family, but we weren't. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but every family had their issues, mine included. There was always gossip and drama around every corner. I tried my best to stay out of it and usually just hung out with my two best friends, James and Brian. The three of us were always on some sort of mission. You know, kids pretending to be army men, tag, and whatever else we deemed fun at the time. We'd always play in the woods behind Brian's house because it was the deepest into the forest you could go without getting lost or stuck. There was also a well. We called it the wishing well. I know, really original. We were 10. Despite its oddity in the forest and how it stuck out like a sore thumb, we paid it no attention. When kids started disappearing, you'd think our neighborhood would be the first ones to be out there frantically looking, but we weren't. At first it was kids I only knew from cookouts and school. My parents told me I couldn't play in the woods anymore for my own safety, and I could only play in front of my house or Brian's. James's house was a much further walk, and since Brian and I lived across from each other, James would always walk down to our houses. When I asked my parents if they knew what was going on, it was always the same answer. I don't know, but someone dangerous is out there, they'd say. Okay then, whatever, I'd respond. They didn't seem panicked, so why would I? Children kept disappearing, slowly but surely, maybe 1 or 2 per year. I don't know, enough to draw concern even though nobody really seemed that concerned. I was fine, my friends were fine, so why should I be concerned? When I was 15, I started to think it was a domino effect. No one was panicking, so other people wouldn't panic sort of thing, but now I'm freaking out. Last week was my 17th birthday. Brian, James, and I went out into the woods to smoke so our parents wouldn't know or smell it. Not long after, we sat down on a fallen tree by the well. Brian and James started fighting. Irritated, I tried to defuse the situation as quickly as possible. Both of them still angry, but calmer, sat back down in silence. We smoked, the tension eased, and it was time to head back. James, obviously still a bit riled up, fast walked ahead of us. Once he was out of hearing range, Brian stopped me. Look, I know it's your birthday, but I need to tell you something. Brian's eyes were as wide as the moon as he continued talking. I know what's been happening. I know where the missing kids go. You know I turn 18 next week, but I don't think I'll make it. Brian froze, scoping his surroundings for potential eavesdroppers before continuing. James was gone. I heard my parents talking, so I sat on the stairs to listen because I thought it was about my birthday present. They were talking about the well, man. His voice grew increasingly more frightened. Supposedly, if a parent throws a coin in the well before their child is 18, they can wish for their child to. He trailed off. He was sweating profusely. Chill, dude. You know how crazy this is about to sound? I replied with confidence. Everything's fine. You're going to be fine, and we're going to party till we drop. I said, trying to sound as convincing as possible. Boy, was I wrong. The next day, I went to Brian's house around noon to see if he was awake. His mother was always up very early, despite her never working. His father worked as an accountant, and it paid pretty well, but he was never home during the day. I knocked. I waited. I knocked again. Nothing. They always answer. I started to worry. I knocked again. Nothing. I haven't seen Brian since we went into the woods for my birthday. No one seems worried. I'm really worried. I'm panicking. I'm losing my ever-loving mind. But not because I don't know where Brian is. It's because I know where he is. Last night I heard my parents talking. My mom is pregnant. My parents had me when they were only 19, and I was told I would probably never have a sibling. I was excited to hear the news until I continued to listen. They're going to kill me, and get away with it. If you toss a coin down the well before your child is 18, you can get rid of your child for another. It gives you a chance to try again with no consequence. A life for a life. A child for a child. I should have listened to Brian. I should have listened to what he had to say. I could have ran. I could have done something. It was too late for him, but if I would have just heard him out, maybe this would be different. But it's not. There's nothing I can do. I hear a faint voice calling to me from behind Brian's house. It's soothing. Like when my mother used to sing to me. Actually, it sounds just like her. I hope she's not out there. I'm going after her. I have to stop this. If I don't come back, let everyone know. I know what happened. I know what happened to all of the missing children. I know why no one in the neighborhood ever had a sibling. The majority of my early childhood was spent in a big house filled with endless possibilities. At least, that's what my preteen self thought at the time. Here in South Asia, kids don't generally move out of their parents' home until they have kids of their own, though that's a tradition that's slowly edging out. Anyway, what that means is I lived with my parents, my older sister, my grandparents, 3 uncles, 2 aunts, and 2 cousins. The latter two were both boys, the older being about 2 years older than my sister, and the younger about a year my junior. We were essentially raised as two sets of twins, and I did not realize my brothers were my cousins and not actual brothers until I was well into my teens. To us, we were brothers and sisters, and that was that. Changing everyone's name here, for privacy. Let's call my eldest brother Priyo, my sister Anna, and my not twin Cam. The thing you need to know about my family is that we're batshit crazy. It was a house full of overly emotional, excitable, very noisy, and very loving people. As we kids grew up, loved and pampered but not spoiled. The first thing we were taught was respect, and it's a lesson I retain to this day. My world was one of hugs and being sneakily handed treats by winking aunts, so my mother didn't see. It was idyllic. I didn't realize until last year that it was not as perfect as I remembered. There were hints of something darker, especially concerning me, that my preteen mind either didn't notice or just ignored. Like how there was a room in the southwest corner of the big house that no one was allowed to enter, and how no one ever told me what was in there. I'd overhear snatches of conversation about that room at times, but those conversations always cut off whenever they saw me. I never tried to sneak in, because that would be disrespectful, and over time, my curiosity faded. There were other odd aspects of life in that place too, like the time I bounced past my youngest uncle's room, on a yoga ball of all things, and I thought he must have invited at least 50 people over because of all the voices. When I bounced in, ready to be cuddled and made a fuss over by him and his friends, I found the room empty, and my uncle fast asleep. I prodded him awake. "Where are your friends?" "At home," he said groggily. "What are you talking about, you undersized elf?" He reached over with a half-asleep arm and mussed my hair. I giggled. "But they were here. I just heard them." Thought I was the one asleep. And I squealed as he grabbed me, and I fell asleep in the crook of his arm, tucked safe and warm. He smelled like ice cream. I woke up to my mom calling everyone to dinner, and was vaguely surprised to find the blankets I'd burrowed under replaced with musty old curtains I'd never seen before. They smelled like fetid meat. "Sarah, get your place before Preo and Cam eat the whole fridge." "Coming, Mom. And someone please tell Uncle Sam to change his curtains. They're gross." But everyone was too busy with the food, and I only mentioned the curtains in passing. I told my eldest aunt to get me better toys on my birthday when I found a rubber snake in the formal sitting room. A toy that I now realized was too thick and skin-like to be a toy. It was striped yellowish orange and black, and at the end was still oozing blood, with bits of flesh still attached. It was too morbid, especially with what looked like a tooth stuck on the bloody end. I was too young to pay attention to the news, but I remember my father and my eldest uncle discussing the break-in at the local zoo. I remember, when I was about 8, I saw 2 kids push another one down the stairs at school. He bounced all the way down, and when he finally stopped at the landing, his neck was bent at a strange angle, with blood gushing from the place in his throat where something white was poking out. I ran over crying to my favorite teacher, and I led her to the stairs. There was nothing there, not even the blood. When she very gently asked me about all 3 of the children, my descriptions matched none of the students enrolled in that school. I sat in the principal's office shaking, and she sat with me, holding me close until my mother came to get me. At home, I found the kid in my room, his neck still broken, holding my favorite teddy. I asked him if he was okay, but he said nothing. His eyes were hauntingly empty. I heard someone laugh in the other room, but when I looked back, he was gone. My teddy's neck was twisted around, and not even my grandmother could fix it. She had to get me a new one. I remember the smoke that I saw sometimes, seeping under the locked door of that forbidden room, thick and oily. I remember the sense of disquiet I'd get, looking at random strangers on the road, and how, whenever I told anyone about it, they'd take it incredibly serious. I remember feeling that way about an old friend of my grandfather's, and how, after I told my granddad about it, he flew into a rage and threw him out of the house. One of my uncles told me a few years ago that, a couple of weeks after that, The man was arrested for filming some pretty bad stuff. My early childhood was not idyllic at all, not even remotely. It's just that my entire family, even Cam, worked so hard to give me good memories that I eventually forgot the strange ones. Until last year. I was 11 years old when my parents purchased a big, beautiful apartment in a newer part of the city, and we moved out. My new home felt strange to me, with no rambling uncles and aunts, and none of my brothers with me. It was lonely. My grandfather died about a year after that, an event that makes me cry to this day. But Granddad's death, the family sort of unwound. My uncles and their families eventually moved out of the big house, until it was just Grandma living there. We'd all gather every few weeks for dinner and a family movie night, but it wasn't the same. As time went by, those odd memories of mine faded, and my brothers and sister grew up. The two sets of twins were not twins anymore, but two brothers and two sisters, and eventually, we became cousins. We were still close, but not like before. I guess that happens as time goes by, but still sad. And then, last year, Grandma called me. That in itself was nothing special, but she didn't sound right to me. "Darling, can you see me this weekend?" I had plans with a bunch of my friends, but this was Grandma. She's important. "Sure, what time? And what are you cooking for me?" She laughed. "Anything you want, my love. Do you still like candy? I have a bunch left." "I'm 25, Grandma." "So, I'm almost 90, and I still like candy." "That's why you barely have any teeth left." I teased her. "Life's too short for teeth. Can you come over for breakfast?" "I can't wait. Love you to bits." "I love you more, sweetheart." Grandma is the most beautiful woman in the entire world. Yes, she's old and stooped, and her skin is wrinkled, but she's beautiful. She has the brightest smile I've ever seen, and she's tough as old roots. She's probably smarter than my entire group of friends put together. Half of my poetry is inspired by her. That morning, she looked like none of it. She did not look bright or tough or smart. She looked old and weary and slightly scared. She smiled and hugged me, but there was no heart in it. It was not a grandma hug at all. Not remotely. I knew something was wrong, and I knew it was big. I tried to lead her inside because I didn't want her to be cold, but she shook her head, and we sat on the old swing by the porch. "Tell me," I said. She did not speak for a long time, and I do not urge her. She'd tell me when she was ready, and she did, and it was a story like none I could have ever expected. "You must have heard the story of your birth 1,000 times by now, sweetheart. Your mother and I, home alone. The others were out, watching Anna's dance recital. But your mom had been feeling tired, so she stayed back, and I stayed with her. She was just 7 months along, but she went into labor. The storm struck, and the rest of the family were forced to stay at the school. Your father ignored the weather warnings and drove home anyway, to find he now had 2 beautiful little girls to love. Your parents' joy was immense. What we never told you was that you were stillborn. Your mother went into labor, and it was the fastest delivery I've ever seen in my life. She bled like a river. I thought I might lose my own daughter. I lifted you from her and quickly wrapped you in towels and placed you on the bed. I was panicking, and your mom was bleeding, and she'd fainted. The storm was raging, and I was watching my own baby girl die in front of me. And then I realized you hadn't cried. You were lying there, in those towels, ashen-faced and silent as the grave. This tiny, beautiful little angel. And beside you was your mother, bleeding her life away. I held you in one arm and her in the other, and I stared out of the window into that hurricane, and I begged for your lives. You know I was never very religious, but I guess there comes a point in every person's life where you give up trying to be strong and just want some higher power to help you. I cried like a mad woman, and I begged for the lives of my daughter and granddaughter, whatever the cost. I do not know how long I stayed that way. I do not remember what I offered for your lives. It did not matter. As long as my family was safe and happy, nothing else mattered. My life for theirs, my soul for theirs, whatever it costs, I'll pay it 1,000 times over. Just give them back to me. Let them live. Let them be healthy and happy and whole. I said it like a mantra, again and again until my voice gave out. Then you stirred. Your tiny forehead wrinkled and you cried. That first piercing cry that announces the arrival of a new soul in this world. And then your mother shivered at the sound. And she opened her eyes. The baby. My joy was a thing so vast it drained me. I carefully, wearily, placed you on her chest. She held you and she began to cry. Your father burst into the room and started laughing and crying at the same time. I left the three of you there. But just before I closed the door, I met your gaze. It was not the gaze of a newborn infant at all. It was the look of a soul 1,000 years older than me. I went to my own room and slept. Never before had I felt so tired, and never since. When I woke up, the storm had cleared and everyone was home. We took you and your mother to the hospital because you were premature, and I was still worried about the blood your mom had lost. You were both released from the hospital a few weeks later, safe and healthy. Yet every time I looked at you, I knew I'd done something terrible. I knew I'd called on something I did not even understand in my desperation to protect you and your mother. And I knew, if I were to keep you safe, everyone had to be aware. I sat them around the dining table and told everyone clearly what had happened. We swore to keep this secret. We locked the door of the room you were born in, and we agreed never to let you in there. When Cam was born, normally, thank goodness, in a bright hospital full of doctors and nurses, we waited until he was old enough to understand, and then we told him about you. And we kept a very careful eye on you as you grew. You could feel things. Your granddad's friend was a madman who attacked and murdered a little boy, wrapped the body in curtains, and threw him into a landfill. You knew that. Your Uncle Sam began associating with a rough crowd, and he was slowly being drawn into their world. You heard their voices, and you asked about them. He stopped hanging out with them shortly afterward. They were human traffickers. The house next door caught fire a few days after you told Cam you'd seen smoke coming from under the door of the locked room. 2 bullies attacked a little boy in your school 6 months after you ran to your teacher, saying someone was hurt in the stairs. We convinced the principal to install a security camera there. Your teacher got the child just before he fell down the steps. A woman broke into the zoo when you were a child and attacked a lot of the animals there. You knew that somehow, and you told your father to look for the tiger's tail. The police found the woman's tooth, and she confessed. Your sister overheard you talking in your sleep one night, that your father and one of your uncles were going to have a terrible argument, a fight that would tear the family apart. Your parents moved out just days later. And then, last week, you left a message on my phone. Here. Grandma held out her phone and I took it from her. I was shaking. My thoughts were a mass of chaos, chasing each other, screaming helplessly. My mouth was painfully dry and I couldn't swallow past the lump in my throat. My heart was a drum in my ears. Very dimly, I could hear a high-pitched keening, like someone screaming. Maybe it was my mind, rebelling at what I'd just heard. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything, because the keening burst from my throat in a roar of horror and disbelief when I looked at my grandma's phone. It was a selfie of me holding up one of the sketches. I remember sending her that picture, very proud of the mountain scene I'd worked for days over, but it was not a peaceful mountain valley I'd drawn at all. It was Grandma's living room, done up in Christmas decorations with a tree in the background and fairy lights everywhere. In the background was my family, my parents, sister, brothers, uncles, aunts, and grandma, on the floor, their throats slashed open, their eyes staring sightlessly forward, and there stood I, in the middle of those bodies, smiling serenely, blood on the knife in my hand, blood dripping down to my white dress from my mouth. I broke the phone. I held it between my hands and I snapped it clean in two. Grandma did not react. I stood up and kissed her on the forehead. I left her sitting on the swing, and I strode through the old house, the house of my childhood. I stopped in front of the locked door to the room in the southwest corner, the room I'd been born in, the room I'd never entered since. It was not locked anymore. The door opened smoothly. I gazed inside. It was a black room, blacker than black, darker than any darkness that should have been possible in this world, like a hole in the fabric of reality, like someone had photoshopped away a piece of the universe. There was no opposite wall, no floor, no ceiling. It was emptiness, like stepping into the void itself, and in the middle of that vast, blank nothingness floated a child, a newborn, glistening in the fluids of birth from the light behind me. She was partially draped in soiled towels, and her eyes were open. And I knew those eyes. I knew the shape and color. I knew the slight upturn on the corners, and the tangled lashes that framed them. I'd seen them hundreds, thousands of times. I'd seen them that very morning, gazing at myself from the mirror. I stepped into the void. There was no floor, yet I walked. There was no air, yet I breathed. I moved over to the child who was me. Her eyes, my eyes, focused on my face. She smiled, and it was a smile of horror. It was a pleasure of pure, ancient pleasure, the likes of which had no place on the face of a human child. But this was not a child, was it? She twisted and arched her back, and I reached out with a numb hand to touch her. The moment I made contact with her skin, she crumbled, like ash, like she'd been made of wood and had been burning for decades, and had finally disintegrated. The debris swirled around me. I twisted, hanging in that huge, forsaken nothingness, and watched, on feeling, as the dust settled on my skin. There was a flare of pain. I gasped, and I was standing on the floor of my childhood home, retching dryly, one hand braced on a blank wall which, for the entirety of my life, had been a locked door that no one had been allowed to enter. Sarah. I turned, swallowing hard to see Grandma standing a few feet away from me. There were tears on her cheeks, same as mine. Sweetheart, what have you done? She whispered. Mom can feel things too, can't she? I asked her quietly. Sarah, please, Grandma. Yeah, she can, since you were born. I swallowed again. I wish I could stop shaking. She won't have to anymore. Sarah, sweetheart. Grandma, I said, you must never look for me. Do you understand? And you must make sure the rest of the family doesn't either. Please, for my sake. But where will you go? She sobbed. I hated that. I hated that someone as tough as my grandma was crying. I'll figure something out. I promise you, I'll be okay. I have your blood. I'm strong too. But the others cannot look for me. You saw the picture. You saw what will happen. I love you, Grandma. I really do. And I walked out of the house quickly, before the sight of her on her knees, crying, could kill me in truth. That was a year ago. I've moved out of the country since then, to a different climate, in a different continent. I've kept mostly to myself. Quarantine was good for someone like me, and the pandemic means I am obliged to have minimal contact with people. It's good. Lonely, but good. True to their word, the family has not contacted me. I try to use my real name as little as possible to make it harder for them, and there are often weeks when the pain of not seeing them is an agony I have to fight past. But then, at times, at the strangest moments, I find myself feeling things. At times, I'm able to stop something bad from happening. Sometimes I can't. I haven't been able to figure out the pattern, or if a pattern even exists. And at other times, I'll see myself in the mirror, and I'll see a strange smile on my face, a smile of ancient pleasure, a smile that should never have been mine at all. Tomorrow is Christmas in my home country, and that ghastly smile has not left my face all day today.